people generally get better. The key thing is, though, you might be tempted so here we have performance data for, say, 2 groups of participants. And you might, in trying to interpret data from this graph, you might be tempted to say, well, the people who are represented by the black squares, they must be better motor learners because their performance is better. And so this is the performance learning distinction. So yes, their performance might be better during practice, during skill acquisition, when you're encoding information about this skill that you're acquiring. But the key thing for us, for those of you who are interested in motor learning, is that we need to implement a retention test, because as part of the definition of motor learning, we want to know if these changes are relatively permanent, right? That if you spend hours with a patient in therapy, you want to know that your training program, will lead to permanent changes, so that 6 months later or a year later, if they come back for follow-up, the skills that they've acquired with your training regime have not been lost. And similarly, if you're a musician, and there may be different pedagogical approaches, the ultimate test, if approach A is better than approach B, is that, at some later time point, when you test the skill again, has that skill been lost? And so that's what we see here with these, what we call retention tests. There's there can be an immediate test or a delayed test, DT, IT, and typically these delayed retention tests would be 24 hours later, the next day. It could be a week. In case of rehabilitation, often we have follow-ups at 3 months, 6 months, a year, right? Because it's important to evaluate whether these skills are permanent. And here, what you can see from this graph is that, you might be tempted to claim that people represented in the black squares are better motor learners if you just look at the acquisition phase of practice. But when you look at retention, what you see here is that they might not be. And in fact, you would claim actually, or interpret that the group that's represented by the white squares are in fact individuals who have learned the skill, because you see that their performance has been relatively maintained. In contrast, in the group depicted by the black squares, there's a slight forgetting. So they're not going all the way back to baseline, in terms of performance, but the skill has not been retained as well as that in the other group. And so here, these data, we would interpret this as, learning might have occurred for those individuals represented by the white squares, but that might not be as strong for the group represented in the black squares. Right, so this is really key. So when you're reading papers about, training and the effects of training, and people are claiming that motor learning has occurred, I guess this take-home message is that you want to look to see at how performance is at these retention tests that should occur at least 24 hours later. So this is a very core and key concept in the field of motor learning, that there's this distinction. So what happens during practice, although performance may improve a lot, there can be other factors that cause this improvement in performance. So it could be your teacher, your coach giving you constant feedback, or maybe you're nervous or you're tired, and so your performance actually isn't as good, right? And so it's really hard, therefore, to know whether learning has truly occurred during this phase of practice. And that's why we really rely on these retention tests in order to infer if learning has occurred or not. So now I'm going to tell you about some studies that we've done, and a lot of the figures will look very similar to what I've just shown you in terms of these performance curves, where we plot performance during skill acquisition, and then performance at some retention test later on. And so the first study that I want to tell you about is that, we wanted to ask the question whether, musicians are actually better motor learners. So we know that as a function of expertise, specifically musicians, and many of you and many researchers and our colleagues and graduate students in this area have shown that, as a function of musical practice and years of practice, we know that there are changes in our the structure and the functioning of our brain, brain. This is just a figure. I really like this figure. It's taken from a review paper by Catherine Wang and Gottfried Schlag, illustrating these changes that occur as a function of expertise. And namely, people have found that, regions such as the motor cortex, cerebellum, premotor cortex, auditory cortex, there have been changes in structure and function that have been reported. And importantly, we also know that musical expertise confers some advantages to performance. And so I was able to revisit a study that I conducted as part of my PhD with Robert and Virginia, where we recruited musicians and non-musicians and asked them to tap along with different rhythms that varied in complexity, from a simple rhythm, a more complex rhythm, and a non-metric rhythm. So a rhythm that doesn't really have an obvious or salient beat structure. And the dependent measures that we looked at was the intertap interval, the deviation, so how accurate were participants in matching the period of their tapping with the stimulus, and as well asynchrony. So how well were they actually able to synchronize to time the taps of their fingers with the sounds that they were hearing. And as you can see, so there are two main effects. First, as a function of rhythmic complexity, people got worse. So as the rhythms became more complex or non-metric, there was greater deviation and more asynchrony in performance. But also in this figure, you can see that performance of musicians shown in the white squares is better, significantly better than that of non-musicians. And this might not be so surprising because, as part of what a musician or a music student or someone who has musical expertise, what they might do is that they're, listening to music, synchronizing, playing along with their peers in an orchestra and an ensemble. So all this training, we think transfers to performance on this task. So when we talk about transfer, we're talking about does training on one skill lead to, does that facilitate performance on a completely different skill? And we can talk about near transfer or far transfer. So near transfer would be probably an example here where the motor task that I'm asking our participants to do is quite similar to what they would do naturally as part of being, as being a musician. But then we also have far transfer. So in this case, then the question is, you have all this motor expertise as a musician. Does that, therefore, can we infer, or is there any evidence that that might make you a better athlete, for example? So it's a completely different, motor skill like golf or basketball, but it involves the motor system. So could there be far transfer in this case? And so that's the question that that my undergraduate student, he's now graduated, but this is work conducted as an honors thesis project by Aaron Baines, who was a fourth year student with me last year. And so he's writing up this manuscript. This is his work under preparation. And so what we did was we took this, laboratory-based, motor task where participants have to squeeze their finger on this force transducer and to navigate this cursor, the blue cursor, across to hit these red targets on the screen, right? And this cursor would move at a set velocity, and the goal was to try to get the cursor into these red squares for as long as you can. So the dependent measure is time that you spend on the target in these red squares. And so this is a relatively straightforward motor task that's been used in many studies, and typically people improve and show retention of the skill. And we also thought that this skill or this task, could be similar to what a pianist might do. As a pianist, as you press down on the keyboard, you also have to modulate the force at which you have to press down on the keyboard with your fingers, right? So there's some force modulation that might be involved during piano playing. You're looking at, musical score. So there's some visual motor integration processing that might be taking place, similar to this, computer task that we're asking our participants to engage in. Right, so they have to look at the visual cue and make an appropriately timed motor response. So something that a musician might engage in as part of their daily practice. And so we hypothesized that there might be transfer. So yes, the answer would be musicians might be better motor learners because of their expertise. But unfortunately, we did not find that. So these are data from his study. And we recruited expert pianists. So these were individuals who had practiced at least 1 hour a day, every day for the past 10 years and who were currently practicing. So they were typically students enrolled in the music program here at U of T. And then we recruited people with no musical training, so who weren't currently practicing, who, and of course, as many of you probably know, it's probably nearly impossible to find people with absolutely no musical training or exposure. So of course, some of these individuals did receive, music lessons as part of the school curriculum, but they were not currently practicing or and did not receive any formal training. And so what you can see here on the figure on the upper left is that we didn't find any significant difference in performance during skill acquisition. So there's a main effect of time. So no surprise, as a function of practice, you'd hope that we'd all get better, and that's what you see, right? So a higher value on the y-axis indicates better performance, but there was no significant effective group, so there's no difference in performance between these two groups of individuals, and there was no interaction. And then we waited 24 hours later and we asked our participants to come back the next day. And again, during this retention test, both groups, they maintained their performance. So we can claim that there was learning of this skill. Performance was relatively maintained. What you see here on the lower left are just the individual data, so individual performance curves, just to convince you that there really wasn't any clear pattern or clear advantage to being a musician, unfortunately. So I guess the take-home message here is that if you're a musician and you want to become, you want to make the Montreal Canadiens team, be a hockey player, elite hockey player, that I think you'll probably have to, at least with this data, you might have to start from scratch, that there was no transfer of skills. What was interesting, though, is we looked at variable error. And so this is this measure indicates, how consistent were individuals' performance. So for each trial, they perform relative to the mean of their own, of the blocks of trial, how consistent was their performance. And we did see this, so this was significant, that musicians actually were more variable, were less consistent. And this is interesting and it merits further exploration. So there's this idea that, perhaps as a function of expertise, that you're exploring the space more, right? That you're not necessarily constrained to solve this problem. They might be trying different strategies. And so this could, be a reason for why the variable error was actually significantly larger during some blocks during skill acquisition. And there has been some research suggesting that the more you explore the space, actually that leads to better learning of the skills. We didn't see that with the mean score data. But this was a small sample, so we'll have to, we're going to look into this a bit more, this idea of exploration, exploitation. So variability, we often think that, that we want a small variability, that is a function of practice, is a function of skill, that people are less variable and more consistent. But there is evidence that, at least in the initial phases of learning, and this might not only pertain to the motor system, that you might actually want to explore the space, right? And that affords certain advantages. So that's work to be continued on, hopefully by another undergraduate student coming on in the fall. And so another study that we did, so that was the first study conducted by a student. And another study that we did, we were interested in the role of exercise. So unfortunately, if you're a musician and you want to become an athlete, there's no easy route. There doesn't seem to be evidence, at least from this small study, that there was any transfer. So, how else could you, become an athlete in a relatively quick period of time? Are there ways in which we can optimize your motor learning of skills to get you there faster? And so there's been a lot of, a handful of research. There's a lot of research in the cognitive domain and in people who are aging, looking at the role of exercise and physical activity in general, in, staving off memory loss, cognitive impairment. And so inspired from that literature, there's been a handful of studies conducted in the area of motor learning, trying to understand if pairing of aerobic exercise with skill learning, so in this case, piano playing, might lead to me becoming a Mozart one day. I originally had a picture of my daughter, but I didn't want to share her face over, so I decided to plaster my face on. So I'm not as cute, I apologize. But the idea here is that, if I engage in a bout of piano practice and then hop on a bike or go on a treadmill and go all out, does that lead to, an optimization of my motor learning? And in Montreal, there are some researchers who are actually interested in this. So Mark Roig from the School of Physical and Occupational Therapy is doing a lot of this work, and it's particularly for stroke recovery. So one of the issues clinically is that when you've had a neurological damage to your brain, such as stroke, not only do you have problems being able to move again, being able to walk and feed yourself, but often you're deconditioned. You don't have endurance. And many of us might take for granted, just to cross the street, right? Especially in a very busy intersection downtown Montreal, where I realized that, there is no leeway. I remember when I first moved to Montreal, when one set of lights turned red, the other turned green right away. Whereas in Toronto, there's like a grace period. And so you could still, take your time to cross the street. So you can imagine for people who have various impairments, it's really challenging. Because they don't have the motor ability, but also they're deconditioned from a cardiovascular perspective. And so many people are interested in this 2-for-1, can you kill two birds with one stone idea, that if you compare these two types of training, exercise, aerobic exercise, and, rehabilitation therapy, can that lead to better outcomes? So that's, sort of the bigger picture of where this research could go. But for this study, this is work conducted by Dana Swarbrick, who was a former master's student, who's now a PhD student at the University of Oslo. And she's actually, she was a varsity rower and a musician. So she has her band, Dana and the Monsters. So she's a singer and guitarist. And so, as part of, as well as a graduate student, I was very fortunate to have the support of Robert and Virginia, who really encouraged me and all of their students to pursue research questions that were really of their interest. And so following along those lines, I encouraged Dana to take up this project because it allowed her to marry two of her passions, exercise and music. And so for these studies, what typically happens is that participants, come in and we give them a graded exercise test. So they go all out on the bike. So we get an idea of what their cardiovascular fitness levels are like. And then we can actually prescribe a fitness routine or exercise routine for them. So that's basically what happens in the first day. And then the experiment properly starts during the second session, where they come in this case, Dana used Synesthesia, this program where you get these visual cues coming down on the computer keyboard, kind of like Guitar Hero. And as the participant, in this case, we recruited people without musical training, so non-musicians. They had to follow the cues on the keyboard and play the corresponding note on a keyboard in front of them. And so they were taught one of two melodies, 12-note melodies, and these melodies actually were piloted or were developed by Rachel Brown and Caroline Palmer and previously tested. So we found two melodies that were relatively similar in difficulty, and participants learned to play one or the other. So you first practice, and then the idea is that you pair the aerobic exercise afterwards. And it could be high intensity interval training HIIT or low intensity interval training LIT. And the idea really here behind the pairing of exercise from a neurophysiological or neuroscience perspective is that when you push yourself really hard, that your body releases various neurochemicals, so brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which is a really key growth factor for the induction of long-term potentiation. So LTP like plasticity. So LTP, long-term potentiation, is the mechanism that we think that supports, learning not only of motor skills, but all sorts of memories in our brain. And so we know that BDNF is important and can facilitate the strengthening of synapses. We know that exercise also releases blood lactate, and that is important. It's fuel for the brain. And so also animal studies have shown that that facilitates neuroplasticity, synaptic strengthening. And so for these reasons, this is why we think that when you pair exercise with skill acquisition, so when you're learning a skill, that also leads to a strengthening of synapses in your brain, right? Through long-term potentiation like plasticity. And so when you are engaged in skill practice, we know these learning processes are occurring inside your brain, but then when you pair that with a bout of exercise, that releases some of these neurochemicals that we also know from a lot of the animal work and some human work are also important for brain plasticity. The idea is that that further optimize someone's performance. And so typically what some studies have shown is that you actually need to engage in high intensity interval training or high intensity training. And so here, this is not really pleasant, you're going all out. So in this case with Dana's study, it was 3 minutes working at 90% of your maximal workload. And then 2 minutes, we're going at a 60% of that. So you're alternating that 3 times. So it's a short bout, but it's very high intensity, right? And then our control condition was low intensity. So instead of choosing rest, we thought that, just having participants engage in cycling with no resistance might be an appropriate control. So this occurred all in the second session, and then they came back 24 hours later to test them on retention of that melody that they had practiced on the day before. And then a week later, they also came back for a retention test, and then we tested for transfer. So did practice on melody 1 lead to better performance on a novel melody? And so then they learned a second melody for which we tested transfer on. So what we found here, so the first panel on the top are data for acquisition. Our dependent measures, we were looking at the accuracy of the key presses, pitch accuracy, and rhythmic accuracy. So how well were participants able to reproduce the onset intervals of the notes within that 12-note melody. We didn't perform any statistical analyses here just because of the way that our paradigm worked. So actually, if for those of you who are interested in learning, it's often a challenge to figure out, how many trials do you give? And as you probably all are aware, that there's a lot of variability in performance, right? So some people it might take, and these are all non-musicians, people with no musical trainings, but for some people it might take them 3 trials and they kind of figure out what they have to do. Or for others, it could take 20 trials, 30 trials, and they still haven't really quite got the task. So what we did here is that we trained to criterion. So for the first 3 blocks of practice, everybody got the same number of trials. But once they hit 3 consecutively correct trials in a row, then they stopped practicing during this phase. And so that's why here in data in blocks 4, 5, and 6, there are a different number of participants in different trials here. So this data, this was the reason why we didn't end up statistically analyzing these acquisition data points. But you can see in general that as a function of practice, people do tend to improve both from a pitch perspective and rhythmic accuracy. What we did do statistically was to analyze the last 10 trials of acquisition. So the last 10 trials of each participant's performance, we compared between the group that engaged in high intensity exercise versus low intensity exercise. And so at the end of the practice, there was no difference for both pitch and rhythm measures. When we look at retention, so they came back, an hour later, 24 hours, and 7 days later, we didn't find an effect of group or time for the pitch measure. So people maintained their performance, so we can claim that they have learned that piano melody, but we didn't see high or low intensity exercise groups to differ significantly. And for the rhythm component, we did see a significant effect of time. So there was actually a slight improvement in performance when people came back to be tested later on, showing that these skills were indeed truly consolidated, and there was perhaps an enhancement of the consolidation of that skill. But again, there was no interaction or main effective group. So we were kind of disappointed, actually, that we didn't see that exercise, at least in this study, didn't seem to modulate or optimize performance more than what happened in the control group. what happens during the transfer test? So this is on day 7. So now, after they've performed that retention test of the melody that they learned, they now are asked to play, to perform a novel melody. And so there was an interaction for both pitch and rhythm measures. So, the rate of improvements in performance for people who underwent the high intensity protocol was slightly higher, greater than that for people who underwent the low intensity protocol. So here we have some modest evidence that there might be some transfer occurring because of the engagement in high intensity exercise. But again, I think, what we want to do now is to follow up with long-term training. So this was just a single bout of exercise. And so one might think that, would a single bout really do it in terms of, optimizing performance? It's likely that, at least for the cardiovascular system, you need to, exercising once will not, allow you to become a marathon runner or a sprinter. You actually need to practice over several weeks or months, or years to become really elite. And so one idea, that we're thinking is that maybe we need multiple bouts in order to really see an effect. And maybe we need to challenge the participants more. There is quite a difference, right? And so there seems to be a ceiling effect with the pitch measure, and there seems to be this floor measure with the floor effect with the rhythm component. And so I think, another thing that we want to look into is the sensitivity of some of the measures that we're using. And so the plan is that we want to move into conducting, a long-term study. But before that, we're currently, so I'm going to be shamelessly putting in a plug, looking for participants to participate in a survey, and you'll receive $5 gift card of your choice. The idea, and I have my clinician thinking cap on right now, is that, if, in an ideal world, if we find after more studies, if there is any evidence that aerobic exercise could indeed enhance the retention, the learning of motor skills, one idea is to move this into, the application realm, right? And our thinking is that with many musicians, and this is the hypothesis that we want to test, is that with many musicians, if you're really fully engaged in your practice, in your art, does that come at a detriment of not engaging in other, activities or physical activities? And so anecdotally, you do often hear about musicians practicing for 6 hours, 8 hours a day. And so if they're sitting down practicing, that means they may not be engaging in a lot of physical activity. And so as a first step, we want to ask, what are the physical activity levels in musicians and in non-musicians to get an understanding. And the idea is that, if we find that musicians are not as active as the average population, then, I think it would be important in order to, and it could be a selling point, right, to pair aerobic exercise to improve their physical activity levels, but as well to potentially enhance some of their performance. And so that's where we're heading with this line of research. And we're definitely looking for graduate students. So if any of you out there who are interested in this area, please feel free to reach out to me. So moving on, now I wanted to tell you about studies that we've done that it tries to harness sounds or auditory stimuli, music, to enhance motor learning. And this first study was conducted by my former postdoc, Shinya Fuji, who is a drummer, and he's now a full professor at Keio University in Japan. And so we were interested in the role of, using sounds as feedback, as augmented feedback, and the clinical rationale behind this. So a lot of things that I do, have this are clinically motivated because eventually, I would like to translate this type of fundamental research. Clinically, with people with stroke, what happens, they have problems with their movements, but they have also problems, with the quality of their movements. So coordinating how their joints, move in space and in time. is often problematic. And one of the biggest debates in our field of stroke recovery is that, what do you teach a patient to do? What do you teach someone who's had a brain injury to relearn? Do you teach them to compensate, or do you teach them to move with qualities? We call that a focus on movement quality. And by compensation, I mean, if I'm going to reach for a cup of coffee, if that cup of coffee was right in front of me, I might just extend my elbow and grab the cup, right? But if I'm someone who has injury and I don't have motor control, I can still accomplish that task, but I might lean forward with my trunk. So I might not have the ability to extend my elbow, so I keep that fixed. But what I do to accomplish that task is that I lean forward to grab that cup. So this is an example of compensation, right? And it turns out this is a lot of what we do with patients. And unfortunately, we think that this is why in the field of stroke recovery, that there is no gold standard treatment, and people sort of improve, but there has been no treatment approach that really facilitates recovery of individuals beyond what we see beyond the recovery that we see that naturally occurs as the function of the brain trying to repair itself. And so the idea here is that, can we use auditory cues to help people actually improve the quality of their movements, right? By using cues as feedback. And so this is a study conducted in healthy individuals as sort of proof of principle, where we had participants, healthy participants, sit, and they just simply had to reach and to touch the target in front of them. And we attached goniometers across the shoulder joint, the elbow joint, and the back. And these goniometers allowed us to detect changes in joint range of motion. Right. So what you see in panel A are the trajectories of the shoulder in 2 dimensions. So shoulder abduction and adduction, and shoulder flexion and extension, right? So your shoulder has 3 degrees of freedom, and we're looking at joint motion in those 2 planes. And as well, we were looking at trunk motion to see if people would be leaning forward with their trunk to perform this task. And we also looked at elbow flexion and extension. And what we had participants do is that, at baseline, they just had to reach to this target. There's a starting target and an end target, and they had to reach to touch that, and recorded the patterns of joint coordination. And so that's what's depicted in this bottom panel here. This is the baseline, reaching pattern. And then what Shinya did is that he reflected, or he manipulated this trajectory so that there was a new target pattern that participants had to learn. And so they kind of had to do something unique or novel or different, right, with their arm in order to get to the target. And the key thing here in this experiment is that all participants had their eyes closed, so they weren't able to see the target, and they solely had to rely on auditory feedback. And so in this experiment, we actually sonified the feedback. So if with your eyes closed, in the beginning, you kind of have to explore the space. And if there was an error, you would hear this loud, pure tone play. And the more error there was, the louder that annoying sound got. So hopefully that was motivation for you to figure out how to perform this movement. And if you were executing this trajectory, moving according to this target, and there was minimal or no error, then you would hear nothing. So the sound of silence. And here, the idea here is we manipulated the frequency of the feedback. So going back to motor learning concepts, we know that, providing feedback after practice is probably one of the most important things that can enhance our learning or augment our learning. And there's this idea out there that too much feedback might not be good. So if you imagine you're taking piano lessons or sports lessons, and if you have your coach or teacher after every trial giving you feedback, telling you what to do, during practice, that might be very helpful. And so your performance improves dramatically, right? Because you're getting all these cues, all this information to guide your performance. But the key thing is that when people come back for a retention test 24 hours later, a week later, when you don't have the feedback, actually people who receive constant feedback tend to perform worse, right? Because they've become dependent and reliant on that feedback. And so this is the guidance hypothesis. And so the idea here is that you don't want to provide feedback all the time. You might want to provide feedback, half the time, for example. And so this is what we were testing here as well. So we manipulated the amount of feedback people received as they performed this task. So one group received feedback on every trial. So every time they had their eyes closed, they had to sort of figure out how to move their arm in space, so through exploration, but they were guided with this annoying pure tone sound that would play. And eventually, the idea is that people would figure out what that target trajectory was. For another group, they only received this feedback on half the trials. And so what happened? So it seems, at least for this task, more feedback was better in promoting motor learning or skill retention. So what you see on the y-axis is root mean square error. The smaller the value, the better the performance. So more accurate, the less error there was in the performance. On the x-axis here, you have performance plotted across the blocks of practice. And then we had an immediate retention test and a delayed retention test that occurred 24 hours later on. And this is performance of the two groups. So one group received 50% feedback. So they got feedback on every other trial, and a group, as depicted in the black circles, they received feedback on every single trial. So during performance, there was actually no difference in performance between the two groups. But what you see at retention is that there was actually a significant main effective group. So people who received feedback on every trial actually were better able to retain or maintain skill performance as compared to people who received feedback on every other trial. We also looked at variable error. So again, this is the measure that looks at how consistent is your performance. And there was no significant difference between groups. Everyone tended to become more consistent as a function of practice, and those effects were maintained. But here we think that, I told you about the guidance hypothesis, but we also think that, that rule or that notion may not always be true, that more feedback is not good for learning, because it really depends. It might depend on the type of skill that you're asking participants to engage in. So there's some evidence from Gabriella Wolf's group. She's out in Nevada, and she's a motor learning researcher, that shows that when you have a more complex skill, and you can probably envision that a harder skill might require more feedback. And it also, the other factor is the level of the skill of the learner. So someone who is an expert might not need as much feedback as someone who is a complete novice. But in any case, here, this is proof of principle work showing that in principle, we can use sounds, sonified sounds, to guide the coordination, guide individuals to learn a novel joint coordination pattern. And the idea here as a future step would be to try to implement this in patients in clinical work. Importantly, trying to minimize the trunk compensation movements and trying to promote, movements of the upper limb, elbow extension, and so on and so forth. And I think, someone like Eckhart Altemuller out in Hanover, they have some studies looking at sonification, right? And so there might be a potential role. There is some preliminary evidence that this might work in people with stroke. So lastly, I want to tell you about some studies that we've done, or that actually Takako Fujioka has led. So in using music-supported rehabilitation. So before I get there, I just want to tell you what a stroke is. I've sort of talked about it without really telling you what it is. So it's really a brain injury, and it can arise from two causes. You could either have a blood clot that prevents blood flow from going to certain regions of the brain. And so if this clot occurs in the arteries that are supplying the motor cortex, that would be the middle cerebral artery territory, then this is what leads to motor impairments, sensory motor impairments. You can also have a hemorrhagic stroke, which is a brain bleed, so blood vessel ruptures, and again, that causes damage, cell death in the region of that stroke. And so a stroke can occur anywhere, but very commonly they occur in the territory that affects sensory motor cortex, the basal ganglia, all the motor regions of the brain, and that's why many individuals with stroke have these sensory motor impairments. And so this is a study that, that was led by Takako at the Rotman Research Institute, and she's now at Stanford University. And I was very fortunate enough to participate in this study, and we analyzed a lot of the imaging data, which I'll present later on. But essentially the idea behind this is that there were two groups of two interventions. The experimental intervention is the music-supported rehabilitation, and where participants are, reaching out to drum pads that are tuned to various pitches to play a melody, and this might be appropriate for someone who might not have fine finger motor control, but for people who were able to control their fingers movements, then they might engage in some practice on a keyboard. And they also use drumsticks. So there are various modalities that were implemented. And so this was 30 hours of training over 10 weeks. And these were people who had what we call chronic stroke, so who've had a stroke for more than 6 months. The control intervention was called GRASP, so Graded Repetitive Arm Supplementary Program. This is a program developed by Janice Ang out at UBC. It's internationally used. This is one of the, an intervention that has a lot of evidence supporting it. We call it best practice. And so this was an appropriate control to use, and so the question is, when you engage in music-supported therapy, would that lead to better outcomes? Would that lead to better improvements or the motor relearning of various motor skills? And I don't think I need to convince this audience here that, music is interesting, it's motivating, it's fun, it's playful, integrates, sounds and movements. There might be a natural link and so on and so forth. So that's sort of the rationale behind why we think there might be, why music might work. With GRASP, people are engaged in sort of performing activities of daily living. So, grabbing objects, buttoning a shirt. These are called functional activities, things that are relevant, right? That we do as part of our daily living. And so participants in this group got to practice those tasks. So disappointingly, I'll say that the findings from the study are not out of line with what we're seeing with almost all stroke studies coming out now, looking at motor recovery, that there was no significant difference really in motor outcomes, whether people engaged in music-supported rehabilitation or the GRASP program. Right, so here, what I'm plotting here are data for these various clinical assessments. So this is the Shidok-McMaster Stroke Assessment Scale. So clinically, instead of root mean square error or, asynchrony, these are measures that we might commonly use in the motor learning, in the music field. When we look at clinical work, we have what we call clinical outcome measures, right? These are standardized measures that everyone, that clinicians, that researchers would use. And so we're all able to compare our findings with each other. And what the scale looks at, the Shidok, is how the movement quality, how well are people able to move their arms. And it's staged. So if you score 7, that means you have relatively normal movements. Here you can see that people are averaging around 3. What this means is that they're able to maybe touch their chin. If their arm is starting in the lap, they can touch their chin. They're able to shrug their shoulders. They're able to touch their opposite knee. Right, and for the hand, it means that they're able to, perform a finger-thumb opposition, that they're able to extend their wrist and then flex their fingers and close. So those types of movements would be coded as roughly, stage 3, which is on average where these participants are at. So these actually are, on average, these participants would have significant impairment. So as a function of practice, so we did the Shidok assessment, or Takako and her research assistant did, at before the intervention started, at post 1, this is 5 weeks into the intervention, and at post 2, which is at 10 weeks, right after 10 weeks of the intervention, and then a follow-up, which was 3 months later. So there was no significant difference, really. There were, in terms of, improvements in arm or hand functioning. The ARAT is a different measure that looks at hand function. So you're grasping blocks and putting them in various shelves, and it's a timed assessment. And so again, there was some modest improvements for people. So here in the ARAT score, a smaller value is actually both scales. A larger value is actually indicative of better performance. So there's really no significant difference. And if any, the changes were small at best. So this was quite disappointing. But as I said, taking in the context of all the stroke rehabilitation trials that are going on, this is what we're finding. So if we take out the music component, it seems that, there's something that we as stroke recovery researchers have not got. And now we think that, some of the things that we now need to address are dose. And are we picking the right people for these interventions? So for this music supported rehabilitation intervention, and there are many others out there led by some of our colleagues, they're getting 30 hours of treatment. That's nothing. I mean, if some of you are musicians or athletes, 30 hours of practice on a skill will not lead you to become, a rock star or an elite athlete, right? So what are we thinking in rehab, right? Do we really think that 30 hours is going to do it and all of a sudden these people are going to walk out of the rehab center? No. So most recent studies now are showing that people need actually 90 hours or even 300 hours. And this is in chronic stroke. This is then you start seeing some improvement. So there's a non-linear effect. Animal models have shown. So people have given rats stroke and have shown that, rats do these reaching movements to retrieve a pellet. They love to eat and that's the reward. They have to do about 600 of these reaching movements in order for you to see improvements in performance occurring, right? So we're really not, I think, in terms of the next generation of music supported research and stroke research in general, we need to start thinking about the amount of therapy that we're giving, what type of therapy. So going back to, are we training movement quality or are we allowing compensation? And so for, I think, a lot of the music supported rehab approaches right now, we're allowing for compensation. We don't really care how they're performing, as long as they're able to reach for that cup of coffee, that's good enough. And you might argue that that is all that's sufficient, right? You might not care about how you look when you're performing your movements, as long as you can achieve the goal. As long as you can walk across the street safely, that might be all you care about. But there's this idea that actually by teaching compensations, we might actually be limiting true motor recovery. And then what I want to focus on is, the patients that we're picking. Are we picking the right patients, right? And so to get to that, I'm going to keep track of time. I know I'm running close to the end. A big part of our research is in trying to identify biomarkers, indicators of disease state, in order to identify who our responders and non-responders are to therapy. So this is not my work. This is work from Gert Kwakkel. He's a Dutch physiotherapist and prolific researcher. This is data in over 400 patients that he's collected over the many years of his career. And what we see here on the y-axis is this clinical assessment of motor impairment, the Fuller-Meyer score of the upper limb. A higher value means that you have more normal recovery, and a low value means that you probably have had a very significant and severe stroke. And we do these assessments, or they did these assessments across these various time points, right? And you can document someone's recovery trajectory. And what you can see here is that there's a lot of variability. A lot of people recover, and they're the good recoverers. Some people have moderate recovery, they're somewhere here. And there's also a good proportion of people who have very poor recovery, who don't really actually recover at all. And so one of the things, that we need to look at is when you're choosing intervention trials, and this might be even for, if we bring it back to the music context, and if you're interested in music training, some of you might know, if you look at your individual, your average data look beautiful. And then once you look at the individual data, you're like, oh my gosh, do we toss out this outlier, or do we keep them? How do we make sense of this, right? And so, here, I think in clinical worlds, we really need to pay attention to the individual performance, right? Because this is telling us something. And this might tell you something for training, right? Maybe there are some people who are going to be, fast learners versus slower learners, right? And this might be relevant in terms of the training approach and the pedagogy that you end up developing. And so we're looking at 2 biomarkers of stroke recovery. So this study uses data from the music-supported rehabilitation work. So these were all the patients who had undergone both GRASP and music-supported therapies. And we took imaging data from them. And this is work conducted by Tim Lam, who was my first master's student. Who now works for the Department of Defense in Canada, scanning brains of soldiers and looking at various interesting things. But here, so the biomarkers of interest that we think can predict performance is damage to the cortical spinal tract. So these are MRI images. The image on the left is a front view of the brain. The image in the middle is a bird's eye view looking down, and the same for the image on the right. And what you see in green is the cortical spinal tract, a template. So this is the main descending white matter pathway that connects motor cortex, motor regions of your brain, to the spinal cord. And what you see in red is an individual person's stroke lesion, right? So this is someone's stroke. And we overlap that to see how much of that overlaps with the cortical spinal tract. So ultimately, if you have damage to this tract, you will have hand and arm impairment. This is the main descending system that allows control of fine motor control. Sarah Bankston and Frederick Guillen has shown that in pianists or musicians, there's actually higher integrity of white matter in this tract, right? And so this was, as a function of practice, they showed that there were white matter structural changes that led to perhaps either pre-existing or as a function of training were correlated with musicianship. And so this is the same fiber pathway that is also important when we think about neurological damage and the motor system. And so we looked at the amount of damage that's occurred that's overlapped between the lesion and the cortical spinal tract. And we're also looking at connectivity, resting state connectivity between left and right motor cortex that represent the hand and arm regions. And we're doing a simple region of interest analysis approach here. So does, the ability of your left and right motor regions of the brain, how they communicate with each other, does that relate to impairment? And so what we see here is that there is indeed a relationship between the amount of damage to the cortical spinal tract as plotted on the y-axis, or the connectivity between the left and right motor cortex, that there is a significant relationship between these biomarkers and impairment. So the more damage you have, the more impaired you are. The more connectivity or the less connectivity you have, the more impaired you are. And what we did was so don't worry about all the numbers on this figure here, on this graph here. What we did was hierarchical regression analyses, trying to understand how much variance can be explained by these biomarkers. And so when you combine, both the structural measure, damage to the cortical spinal tract, and integrity or communication between the left and right motor cortices, together, these 2 bits of information account for almost 50% of the variance in motor impairment, in the score that we obtained, and that evaluates how well people are moving their upper limbs. And so the key thing now is next steps is to be able to figure out, is there a threshold? So if we go back to, this is data from Takako's study, right? So these are all the patients who either engaged in MSR or, the GRASP therapy. And so here I would say a score of 6. So this is combining the assessments for the arm and for the hand. This tells me, if you're at a score of 6, this tells me that you have significant impairment. And what we're seeing here is that over half the participants in this study all were significantly impaired, right? So if you go back to this, they might be these individuals here, right? And so this is telling us something that, maybe we didn't really see an effect because the potential for recovery, for motor relearning in these people may have been limited, right? And so I think, for the next generation of some of these studies, we need to really think about biomarkers, right? To select the right people for the right therapies. Because if you had someone who had poor recovery, you might need to teach them compensatory, approaches, right? Or teach them to use the less affected limb. Whereas for people who have good or moderate recovery, you might want to engage in force use, really get them to engage practice of that affected limb, right? And so by knowing, what the state of the motor system is, that might allow us to better prescribe our therapies. And therefore, maybe, I think this would be the test, is music supported rehabilitation? Are these music-based approaches, are they indeed actually better than some of the more conventional approaches that are implemented today? So this is where I think biomarkers are really important, and they can help us fine tune. In this case, for me, it's rehabilitation interventions. But for those of you maybe interested in music training, training pedagogies, right, trying to figure out who are the responders and non-responders, the good learners and the slower learners, that might help tailor, or that might help, tailor your therapy, your training programs. So just to recap everything that we've talked about today, so some of the key concepts are that motor learning, if you don't remember anything else, just remember that motor learning reflects relatively permanent changes in skill. And so if any of you conducting experiments on motor learning, you really need to have that retention test at least 24 hours later, right? And then in terms of the scientific work in the realm of music that we've conducted, are musicians better motor learners? Maybe not. I think, this is just one study and we'd have to do more. But, I think it's an interesting area, right? Is there far transfer? If you're a musician, does that mean that you're going to be, the next Tiger Woods? We don't know, but at least with the evidence from our study, that might not be the case. Can aerobic exercise facilitate piano learning? Again, maybe. We had some modest effects in terms of transfer, but these these effects were from a short-term single bout of training. And so future work will be required to really test if we had multiple bouts, weeks of training paired with practice, would that actually lead to an optimization of performance? In terms of harnessing sounds and music, for training, can we learn new movement patterns using auditory feedback? Yes. So by manipulating the frequency of the feedback and how we sonified the feedback, we were able to promote or optimize learning for healthy individuals as they learn to make a movement with their limb. And lastly, can we use music to prove stroke recovery? I think the verdict is still out there, maybe, but I think a lot more work has to be done. So that, I think, brings us close to the end. And these are just some of the personal take-home messages that I have, which is, follow your passion. Many of you are now doing research, engage in research, or maybe trying to figure out what that is. Listen to your heart, listen to your gut. Research is, I think you have to really love it in order to be fully engaged. And so I hope that you all have the opportunity to do what really interests you. And that's what I've been able to do. And now I've been able to combine my passions in music and neuroplasticity and stroke recovery together. And lastly, I think it's also great to be a graduate student because this is your chance to learn how to learn. And this is what Robert and Virginia taught me. So I've presented studies on exercise. I didn't know anything about exercise, or goniometers, kinematics. I just purchased, 3 off-track systems for my lab. I didn't get this training, right, in Robert and Virginia's lab. I got the neuroimaging training, which I now am applying. But, as part of the research enterprise, hopefully what you're learning to become experts in your respective fields, but as well, hopefully you're learning how to learn, learning how to problem solve, right? And so that's what I've been very lucky to have, gained that experience from being a part of BRAMS, being exposed to the different ways of thinking and the different perspectives. And so keep on. Hopefully you'll be able to keep on doing this. So that's it. I just want to thank everybody who helped with the research. The stroke study really came out of the Rotman Research Institute, really led by Takako. So this work would not have been accomplished without all these individuals. To my colleagues at U of T for helping us with some of the exercise studies, my colleagues at Sunnybrook, Sandra Black and Kie and Alex Kiss, our statistician, and all the students whose work I presented today. So that's it. I want to thank you. Merci beaucoup for your attention. And I'll stop at this.
Thank you, Joyce. Oh, this this was great. Thank you for being here and to present for us today. We have some minutes for questions right now, and I would like to open for anyone who used to use a microphone or and talk. Please feel free to do so. If you don't want to use a microphone, just post your question on the chat, and I can read for Joyce, and we can work on this together. So does anyone has any question? Oh, Isabel has. Okay. First David, and then Isabel. There's a chat question I can read later. Please, David.
Sure, thank you. Very interesting, and I enjoyed the talk very much. I was struck by one particular piece, and that was where you were categorizing the musicians and non-musicians, and I thought it was interesting that you seem to leave out kind of the middle ground of the semi-serious musicians. And you know what I'm talking about, like me, you know, and maybe you, you didn't formally study music as a program of study, but you've played in ensembles. You're a musician, and you know that, and studies have shown that segment performs better on certain tasks than non-musicians, and often similar to professional musicians. I just wondered if the connection between musicianship and motor skills or these other things you're describing, I wonder if the kind of being good, like kind of good at something, might be the kind of that middle ground that might have a different effect than maybe the two extremes of super serious study music versus no real study. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
That's a wonderful question and point. And you're right. So there's this thing called specificity of practice in the motor learning field, right? And so you could argue that as a very elite level musician, you're kind of fixed in your repertoire. And so you are expert in your domain, but that actually limits your ability to explore and to transfer that into other domains. And so that's a really good point. Our rationale at that time was in thinking that we wanted to recruit the extreme ends, thinking that if they were experts, then is there that transfer? But you're right, we could actually include that third group, which, you know, you're right, includes many of us probably who've dabbled around and see that. So I agree with your point there. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. So I will follow up with Isabelle Bonneau question. So she said, wrote, if the connectivity of the motor region appears as a biomarker, could musical training be a factor of protection for brain injuries that would make music intervention more efficient with a population that already have enhanced connection, for example, auditory motor loop?
Yeah, so the question is, would would musical expertise or training sort of offer some neuroprotection because maybe there are strengthened connections like the auditory motor loop? I think it will depend on where the stroke, in the case of clinical, where that stroke is. So you could have a strong auditory motor loop, or, you know, as many studies shown, you know, there's larger gray matter volume in various cortical and subcortical regions. But ultimately, so music could offer some protection, but it really will depend on where that stroke is. So if that stroke has completely taken out your auditory motor loop, your brain might not be able to compensate. I mean, I guess you can think maybe aphasia is different. So this is Gottfried Schlag's work, you know, with the melodic intonation therapy. And so typically speech is represented in most people in the left hemisphere. So in that context, I could see that, you know, perhaps having musical training, a strengthened, maybe if you think that the musical training also involves the right arcuate fasciculus, the right auditory motor loop, that if you have damage to the left, that you can bring in and strengthen the right side to facilitate language and speech again. I think that could be an example where, yes, maybe musical training could have an interactive effect. I don't know if Gottfried or anyone else has tested that. But in terms of the motor system, often, it's really dictated by where that stroke is. So if it actually does occur in motor regions or in the cerebellar regions, then those brain cells are dead. And I guess, there might be some compensatory abilities, but we don't know. I don't know if anyone's really tested that yet. But that's a really good and interesting question. And I think that's what probably a lot of people, I don't know if anyone's actually testing that, whether people with musical training would do better with some of these music-based approaches. So I think I'd be curious to know if there's any evidence for that. But thank you for that question.
You're welcome. Actually, it was also a little bit more about the, well, it was part of the question. You perfectly answered my interrogation. It was also as part of the, when you mentioned the point, who are we picking as patient for recovery, as wondering if for the motor recovery, the music intervention would have worked better with musicians than non-musicians.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, so I think that's the question that we don't know. And I don't know if, I don't recall if, I don't think Takako in the inclusion, I don't think we have the data to answer that for this question. I'd have to go check. Yeah. So I don't think we have the data. I don't think that was a priori hypothesis that, Takako wanted to test. But I think moving forward, that would definitely be interesting to see if there is this. I think, I wonder if Eckhart Altemüller has some paper on something. It may not be on stroke, but for some reason, I can look for it and send it out to the committee members to forward to you. I wonder if Eckhart Altemüller has done something like that, looking at people with musical training and how that affects some aspect of recovery. So I'm sorry, I don't have a direct answer, but I can look into it and get back to you.
Both points were super interesting. Thank you so much. Great talk.
Thank you for the question. There's another one, Marie-Unique.
Yes, hi. My question was actually concerning singers or professional singers or trained singers. Since the skills that you mentioned that were acquired through musical training, I was wondering if that addresses, there seem to be like mostly cognitive skills, but do you think the way singers through their training will acquire the same skills as instrumentalists, knowing that the essential of their training is not doesn't really involve the same voluntary motor skills as a instrumentalist will develop? What do you, did you have the chance to study some singers, I would say, behavior in that study?
No, we didn't, but that's a great point. And I can think of two. So on the one hand, you could argue that there might be some transfer, because when we talk about singers, it's a different effector, the vocal cords versus the hand. And so there is some general fundamental evidence that if you were tapping along to the beat with your finger or singing along or tapping with your feet, that it might not matter which effector you use, that performance seems to be similar, right? So this links to this idea of a generalized motor program, the GMP, which is an idea put forward in the motor learning literature by Richard Schmidt, that what you're learning is generalized, and so that it's not effector specific. So that camp would argue that, perhaps you wouldn't find that singers would perform similarly as instrumentalists. But then on the other side, you have this idea of specificity of practice. And so I guess it might depend on what skill we're looking at. And so maybe, I don't know actually if there would be transfer, if vocalists would also be equally as well. Oh, actually, no, Virginia student did this study, they tested drummers. And Virginia, I know you're out there, so maybe you can chime in. The study where they looked at tapping, there were expert drummers, because the idea is maybe drummers, you're practicing and engaging in rhythmic training all the time. So I think they tested drummers, maybe pianists, vocalists, I think. And so I think they did, I don't think they found a difference actually And so that vocalists also performed similarly to other instrumentalists when it came to this musical tapping task. So that's a piece of evidence that suggests, again, that maybe it's not effector specific, and so that there is some generalization. I don't know if that answers your question a little bit, but yeah. I didn't test singers, but I think that would be interesting to do.
Which means that basically, whether you're a vocalist or an instrumentalist, the musicianship, the way you acquire your musicianship would be the same and wouldn't be linked to your motor development as the mastering of an instrument. Or... Yeah,
I think it would depend on the task. So in that case, with a Virginia student, I think it was Tomas, I think the task was rhythmic timing. And so you could argue as a singer, rhythm is still very important and that you would receive training. And so that could be a reason why that common element is the rhythm that all musicians are engaged in. And so that's why you don't necessarily see a difference. But maybe if there was a different task, I don't know, maybe you might see differences with singers and instrumentalists.
Okay, I see. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Very.
Thank you, Marie. Virginia, another question there.
Hey, Joyce, it's very good to see you. That was a fantastic talk. I'll just say, apropos of the singer and other types of musicians comparison, I think what we saw really fits with some of the kinds of things that you're talking about, which is that on more global rhythm tasks, all of the musicians, so the singers, the vocalists, the violinists, and the pianists all performed similarly. And the only small difference that we saw was in terms of the timing accuracy for the pianists. And we think it's because what they were doing was tapping on a key. So that if the task is very similar to their training, then you get more transfer. So I think you're absolutely right that it depends on the similarity between the training and the outcome. So I was really curious about the exercise study because, of course, on the one hand, you think to yourself, well, what does like bicycle riding have to do with motor, fine motor learning? But we know that there are those studies out there that are showing these transfer effects. And one thing I thought about in your study was that it looked like there was more of an effect on the pitch component of the task. And excuse me, I wondered what you thought, because I think, but I don't totally remember, that there's evidence that these aerobic training have an effect on memory, also retention. And I wondered if you thought that the pitch component of the task was more of like a sort of explicit memory task. So it's this finger goes with this key or goes with this pitch. And could that be the way that's working? I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I hadn't thought about that until you just brought this up. You're right. So, pitch, people generally, I think if you think about fit stages of motor learning, it's the cognitive stage. What do I have to do? What the hell? What do I have to do? Right. And so it's like this, yeah, right? You're so making like, making these associations. And so for sure, I think there's emerging evidence that doesn't necessarily rely on M1. It's, higher order prefrontal or sequencing SMA prefrontal regions. And you're right. So it's more cognitive, and traditionally where this exercise literature started, right? Looking at cognition, using exercise to improve cognition in older adults, and to prevent memory loss, right? Semantic memory and so on and so forth. So you could, I think that could be, I think that's a good point, that it might be that with our tasks, people generally figure it out quickly. And so maybe there's not, the task might not have been appropriate, that it taps into this cognitive mechanism and maybe we didn't challenge it enough. So the effects that we saw were small, but if we challenge the cognitive systems more, then maybe we'd see, across a span of multiple sessions, they not only have to play the single melody, but actually have to learn a whole piano sonata or something like that. That's where maybe, you could argue that the effects would be elicited. And then I think on the flip side, then it would be really, you're right. So that's sort of a cognitive component, and maybe that's what they're learning, and that's what exercise has an effect on, not necessarily the motor specific aspect of execution. And so for that, I think, so we have this new lab. We have 3 motion, off-the-track motion sensors. We have this Yamaha avant-grand piano. So our plan is to stick on kinematics sensors on the fingers. So, to get really at movement quality. And so maybe this would then allow us to look at parameters of movement, motor control that might change. And so I think that would be an interesting study to see if there's a dissociation, effects of exercise on the more cognitive components of motor skill acquisition, but there's also the motor control aspects, and do those elements change? So, so thanks for that suggestion and thought. That's really great.
Thank you, Virginia. Actually, I have a follow-up question. This is actually something that interests me as well. So the performance retention exercise, the results was quite unexpected for me. Just because the anecdotal evidence that I've been seeing from other musicians, professional musicians, is that after an injury, but it's actually not a brain injury, but a motor injury, they started to do exercises, and they feel an increase in not only in the better motor skills, they regain the motor skills, but also an increase in the memorization and all the activities to learn new music. So my question is, did you ever thought about a longitudinal study to follow those professional musicians? Or so I know it's hard. It's probably hard to find a case where they get the injury and then they recover. But maybe something like this it would be interesting to follow up and see over time for professional musicians doing exercise for a long period, how they evolve in this matter.
Yeah, that's a great point. We do want to do a longitudinal training study, but that's also another good approach by just trying to recruit musicians who've had injury and, follow them sort of observationally to see how that might affect their performance. Yeah, and this is where I think, the longitudinal component is really going to be important. And for sure, anecdotally, we've also heard like wind players, they actually will purposely go and exercise because actually as part of what they do in terms of performance on their instrument, they need a good cardiovascular functioning. And so so this is something that we would love to follow up on. So if there are any graduate students there or undergrad students looking interested in this area, please let me know, because we'd love to continue Dana's work in really trying to dissociate all these different factors, cognitive, motor control, but also, if we do this longitudinally, do we see an effect?
Great, thank you for the answer. And do we have any other questions in the audience? Oh yeah, Simone, please.
I
don't think we can hear you, Simone.
Oh yeah, now it should work. Hi Joyce. Great talk. Thank you so much. And it's great to see you after such a long time. I have just a question about your point, the last point on biomarkers. And of course, it's clear that across all the different studies, there is a lot of variability that we find in patient populations. You see this in stroke, we see this in Parkinson, and it's always hard to deal with this huge variability, especially if we look at the effect on the average performance of the group. So it's great that you basically show this graph where you see how the trajectories can be really very different from one patient to the others. So from a clinical standpoint, do you have any intuition or suggestions about markers which can easily collected in the lab, apart from the biomarkers that you indicated, that, for example, could be collected, just with a simple behavioral task, which could give us an idea, okay, one of those patients may benefit more from the treatment. And the reason I'm asking, is that we are doing that with Parkinson at the moment. So we see, you can have different trajectories, responders versus non-responders, just by very simple tasks. We do finger tapping tasks that you know very well. And they seem to work pretty well. Of course, we will need to validate that with big samples, but I wanted to, to have your thoughts about that. in the towards going towards individualization, right? This is the goal, right? It seems like, and I'm pretty sure you agree with me here, that there doesn't seem to be one intervention which will work for everybody, and so we'd better know what, on the first place, what kind of who among the patients are the most likely to benefit from the treatment.
Yeah,
So-
no, that's a really great question and really important for many of us who are interested in clinical application. So I would say I'm not as familiar with Parkinson's. People that I work with are mostly stroke. I would say the move is that actually these neurological biomarkers provide added value for people who have severe impairment. So you're right. In an ideal world, if there's some quick behavioral test we can do, who has the money for fancy imaging, and then it's like, are you MRI compatible and all that? So I agree, if there's a quick behavioral screen, that would be the best. So for stroke, we know that there's this, as long as you can extend your fingers and abduct your arms, safe, shoulder abduction, finger extension, if people can do that, we know that they're going to be on their way for good recovery. And so in stroke, people who have mild or, mild impairments, clinically, you can tell right away from some of these assessments. And actually, in reality, these people, neurologists, don't worry too much about, because they generally will recover a good extent to their functioning. It's everyone else who, is a bit more confusing. This is where we think these imaging biomarkers can come into play, at least for stroke. I don't know for Parkinson's. This is because, these clinical biomarkers, they just sort of tell you the phenotype, but the neurological biomarkers give you a little bit more information. So what we've seen, this actually, Gottfried has a really nice paper on this, that you could have two patients that present with the same clinical score. One will go on to improve, one will not improve. So that tells you that with the clinical score, it's not enough for some people. And so when you add, at least in stroke, the cortical spinal tract, you could measure this with TMS or imaging, that provides added value and sort of improves that prediction and certainty as to whether you're going to be in the moderate or the poor group. So at least for stroke, it depends. I guess the answer is it depends, and so if it's someone who's not as impaired, the clinical assessments are good enough. But there are going to be people who have clinical assessments in which you can't really tell. And this is kind of key, because based on that number, that random number, you may get rehab and you might not get rehab. And so, God forbid, you wouldn't want to be the one who doesn't get rehab when you should have, right? And so this is where we think neurological biomarkers could be helpful. And you're right, like MRI, even TMS is not really feasible. So people, at least we've been moving to EEG. There's a lot of portable EEG. So you can get maybe M1 connectivity. I don't know. Yeah, basal ganglia would be harder because they're deeper structures with EEG. FNIRS, I think, is becoming a hot topic as well. So I think in the stroke world, this is where some people are moving towards. And also kinematics, because they tell you a bit more than just the clinical assessment, right? So now with Microsoft Connect, to make it sort of feasible, instead of getting people into labs with all these fancy mocap technologies, just with simple motion tracking systems with some of these computer games, can you extract some information about kinematics, and can that be helpful? So this is where, sort of from the stroke field, where things are going. I guess the answer is it depends. But I agree, if we could find a clinical assessment, a tool, behavior tool, that would be the ideal scenario. But I don't know if that's we're there yet for at least for stroke.
Yeah, actually, my question is exactly, so can we think of something better than the usual clinical assessment that we know, are not capable of pinpointing potential in different profiles of improvement, because the training is musical, so there can be possibly measures which are more relevant for the kind of training that we are implementing, and then they may be more sensitive also to the capability of the patient before the training is carried out.
Yeah, no, for sure. Do you have any are there any
Well,
leads from
in the case of Parkinson, we use auditory motor synchronization and beat perception. They seem to work pretty well. I'm not saying that it's going to extend to anything else, but the training that we do is rhythmic, right? So it's relevant to the training. So maybe, thinking of some assessment which is closer to the way, to the function is trained, may be relevant in a way to determine if the patient can benefit from that training or not in the first place. But it's just an idea, I don't know if it may work with
I mean, that's I'll point you. So I was part of a thesis committee. Lucas Crosby and Kara Patterson is the investigator. So actually, they're interested in rhythmic training for gait, for temporal gait asymmetry, and his thesis was all about, does music training, does rhythmic training. So yeah, does the beat perception and beat production tests, does that kind of predict who might be responders and non-responders to this sort of rhythmic auditory stimulation approach that they were doing?
Yeah, we have evidence that this is the case. We published 2 studies recently, and not on big cohorts, but we have an indication that this is the case.
Yeah. So that's great. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. And unfortunately, we are getting closer to the end. I would like to thank again Dr. Joyce Chen to be here with us today. It was a great talk and a great discussion with everyone, and thank everyone for being here. We have, before I made the announcements for the next part, Dr. Chen, do you have any last words?
Just to say thank you so much. It was really wonderful to see some familiar faces and to meet some of you. And I hope that I'll be able to come to Montreal in person soon one day to actually see you guys in person and to visit the different institutions. So thank you, everyone. Again, I really appreciate this opportunity to share some of the work that we've done.
Thank you. We'll do a short break, actually 13 minutes break, and we'll be back at 11 with the first section Q&A for the presentations that are available on the website, on the COBS website. So you can just check there if you didn't already. And we'll be here 11 a.m. to continue. Thank you.
On peut peut-être stopper l'enregistrement.
Is there anything else from my end?